She'll make it 35. You cheat always. Good morning. Good morning. Good afternoon. Hello. Good afternoon, dear students. Doesn't work. It doesn't work at all. All right. Hello. Focus. You're in a strange mood today, all of you.
Sun's out.
It was. I mean, during the exam, I thought it was impressive that you were so focused. No, I'm not so sure that was it at all. You're just in a strange mood.
Well, you know you always have to have the down after you.
What? You're not down. You're kind of like, woo! All right, 2 Chronicles. Hello. Hello. Earth to class. Earth to class. So, my intention is that we finish our read through 2 Chronicles. Again, we're not required to read that much, so it won't take all that long. And then we'll have a break, and then we'll do our next small group, and then we'll be down to the third, which is kind of a grab bag of short, disappointing prophetic books. Okay, nobody's favorite prophetic books come later. So I went on about the poles and the ark and how the narrative here doesn't quite fit hand in glove with the narratives of the Torah. Chapter 7. Chapter 6 is a very grandiose prayer. It's very close to the prayer of 1 Kings 8, where Solomon acknowledges, if this happens and we come here, you, God, will meet us. And again, it reemphasizes that the temple is the place of God's mercy, where we can count on God's mercy, where he pledged to meet us. Chapter 7. When Solomon had ended his prayer, fire came down from heaven and consumed the burnt offering and the sacrifices, and the glory of the Lord filled the temple, and the priests could not enter the house of the Lord because the glory of the Lord filled the Lord's house. Now, that's a parallel to the book of Leviticus, chapter 9, verse 24, when after Aaron and his sons were anointed and the altar was set up and there was going to be a sacrifice, God's fire came down to consume the fire. And then we've seen the glory of God, that shining that cannot be directly looked at. We saw it with Ezekiel. So it too fills the area of the temple. God takes possession of the temple. Verse 6. The priests stood at their posts, the Levites also with the instruments for music to the Lord, which King David had made, for giving thanks to the Lord, for his steadfast love endures forever. That line is a new creation. In the midst of the books of Kings version of the dedication of the temple, we have much of that here, but then a typical set of concerns for the chronicler. That is, that everything is in order, the clergy are in their place, the music is uber apparent, and everybody gives thanks to the Lord. Verse 16. The Lord appears to Solomon in the night, so presumably in a dream. And as part of this message in verse 16, the Lord says, "For now I have chosen and consecrated this house, that my name may be there forever. My eyes and my heart will be there for all time. And as for you, if you walk before me, as David your father walked, doing according to all that I have commanded you, and keeping my statutes and my ordinances, then I will establish your royal throne, as I covenanted with David your father, saying, there shall not fail you a man to rule Israel." So this, again, is the reiteration of the pledge that there would be a Davidic offspring on the throne forever. Chapter 8 gives us a look at Solomon's rule as a political monarch. Look at verse 11. Solomon brought Pharaoh's daughter up from the city of David to the house which he had built for her, but he said, "My wife shall not live in the house of David, king of Israel, for the places to which the ark of the Lord has come are holy." So he sends her out. He doesn't allow the queen, the Pharaoh's daughter. Again, a king like Solomon, as kings tell us, made many alliances with neighboring kingdoms, and as part of that, there'd be marriages, fictional and real. But in any case, the Pharaoh's daughter is not allowed to live in the temple, which does what? It draws a line that says that Solomon in Chronicles is going to be more careful than Solomon in Kings. Solomon in Kings built temples for all his wives. 300 of them, I think there were, from every different nationality and religion. And that's the problem with Solomon in Kings. That's why the kingdom's going to be ripped from his hands, because he's proven unable to be faithful like his father. But the author of Chronicles sees it just a little bit differently. Solomon's just as David is his picture is cleaned up, so Solomon is a little bit as well. Verse 26, kind of a summary passage about his success. He ruled over all the kings from the Euphrates to the land of the Philistines and to the border of Egypt. So,
Chapter 9.
what did I say?
You said it, yes. You didn't say chapter 9.
I did in chapter 9, but I said something. I made you guess. And so you guessed right, and so you guessed wrong. All right, 9:26. He ruled over all the kings from the Euphrates to the land of the Philistines and to the border of Egypt. So the author stakes out a macro vision of the size of the monarchy under Solomon, up to the Euphrates, down to the border with Egypt. And the king made silver as common in Jerusalem as stones, and cedar as plentiful as the sycamore of the Shephelah. Cedar, not a little bush, but the grand cedar tree from which wood was coming that built the temple up. So in essence, the author is saying that through Solomon's leadership, the land also became economically productive, and he was in every way a remarkable ruler, wealthy, powerful, religious. Okay? 29. Now, all the rest of the acts of Solomon, from first to last, are they not written in the history of Nathan the prophet, and in the prophecy of Ahijah the Shilonite, and the visions of Edu the seer concerning Jeroboam son of Nebat? Solomon reigned in Jerusalem over all Israel 40 years, and Solomon slept with his fathers and was buried in the city of David his father, and Rehoboam his son reigned in his stead. What we don't have here again is God's judgment against Solomon as it appears in 1 Samuel chapter 11, where for all his infidelities, it's predicted that God is going to take the kingdom from Solomon and tear it into pieces. Okay? So again, we have that same protective view of Solomon as we did of David. Now, the story continues. Rehoboam, remember, is the son of Solomon, and famously, he is confronted by a prophet whose name had just been mentioned, Ahijah the Shilonite. He first confronts Jeroboam. Jeroboam had been a man in the service of Solomon. he was responsible for the slave labor crews, and Ahijah comes and takes his cloak and rips it up into 12 parts and tells him to take 10 and predicts that he's going to be, therefore, a king of the north. And then Rehoboam comes along, and he is arrogant, and he pushes the slave labor crew harder. And that is reflected here. It wasn't part of your reading, but in chapter 10, it's verse 14. King Rehoboam spoke to them according to the counsel of the young men, saying, my father made your yoke heavy. I will add to it. My father chastised you with whips. I will chastise you with scorpions. And that leads, nice guy, huh? That leads to the rupture between the north and the south. Now, your homework also avoids that, but the author of 2 Chronicles focuses only on the story of the southern kingdom. After this split, he doesn't really follow the northern tribes much at all, unlike Kings. Remember, Kings would keep them both in parallel. We'd read about southern king, and then we'd read about a northern kingdom, as a contemporary king, but that's not Chronicles' deal. He wants just to follow the kings of the south. So we're going to skip a whole bunch of kings, and we're going to land where in chapter 28 with Ahaz. Remember Ahaz? His wife was Jezebel, and he was the he is the opponent of Isaiah. Isaiah is alive at the time, and they kind of go at it. Remember that. So look at chapter 28. Chapter 28. Ahaz was 20 years old when he began to reign. He reigned 16 years in Jerusalem. He did not do what was right in the eyes of the Lord, like his father David, but walked in the ways of the kings of Israel. He even made molten images for the Baals, and he burned incense in the valley of the son of Hinnom. Stop, Mark. I said Ahaz, and you said Jezebel, and I said yes. That's Ahab. That's a northern kingdom. So I should whoa! I let it go until my brain said, stop, danger, danger. Okay, this is not Ahab and Jezebel and Elijah. That's the northern kingdom. This is Ahaz, contemporary of the historical prophet is Isaiah. Okay, a century, a century later than Elijah anyway. So now back to the text. He even made molten images for the Baals, and he burned incense in the valley of the son of Hinnom, and burned his sons as an offering, according to the abominable practices of the nations whom the Lord drove out before the people of Israel. Do you remember when we read Isaiah? There's that famous scene where Isaiah confronts Ahaz. Ahaz is traveling around the city, checking out its defenses and the water system. And Isaiah comes with his son, Shir-Jashub, remnant shall remain, or something like that. And Isaiah is urging him not to make an alliance with the Assyrians. Remember the king of Israel, the king of Aram, they're both putting pressure. They say, Ahaz, join us in our war against Assyria, or we're going to dethrone you. And so this is when Isaiah confronts him and says, ask for a sign, ask for any sign. And Ahaz says, oh, I will not tempt the Lord, I will not ask for a sign. And Isaiah is frustrated and says, in God's behalf, saying, it's one thing to weary men, must you also weary God. God's going to give you a sign. The virgin / young woman shall bear a son. And when we talked about that, I spoke about, that probably what's going on is reference to this. The king had sacrificed his son, the heir, in trying to get Yahweh's response to get him out of this political problem. And so what Isaiah at the historical level is pledging is your line is not over. God has not given up on you. You're going to have an offspring, a child who will be Messiah, who will be the new king. And who is that going to be? What's Ahaz's son? Who's that? You know his son. Hezekiah. Remember, good King Hezekiah, who does the little renewal of the temple? Okay, so we did read this passage, or maybe I made reference to it when we read Isaiah, that might shed light on why Isaiah says that the king is going to have a child, and that child is going to be, as that child grows, it's going to be an evidence of God's victory for Judah and the defeat of his enemies. Okay, so again, we read this just because it emphasizes again how child sacrifice was not part of the law and of God's desire. Verse 19, chapter 28. Yes. The Lord brought Judah low because of Ahaz, king of Israel, for he had dealt wantonly in Judah and had been faithless to the Lord. So Tiglath-Pileser, king of Assyria, came against him and afflicted him instead of strengthening him. For Ahaz took from the house of the Lord and the house of the king and of the princes and gave tribute to the king of Assyria, but it did not help him. Verse 23. For he sacrificed to the gods of Damascus, which had defeated him, and said, because the gods of the kings of Assyria helped them, I will sacrifice to them that they may help me. But they were the ruin of him and of all Israel. And Ahaz gathered together the vessels of the house of God and cut in pieces the vessels of the house of God. And he shut up the doors of the house of the Lord. And he made himself altars in every corner of Jerusalem, in every city of Judah. He made high places to burn incense to other gods, provoking to anger the Lord, the God of his fathers. Now, these accusations do not appear so clearly in the books of Kings as they do here. Again, Ahaz is the bad king to be the contrast to his son, Hezekiah, who will be the good king. How old was this king? Remember at the beginning, we were told his age. In chapter 27, verse 1, he lives to be 36 years of age. Somehow, I tend to think of him as much older than that when I read Isaiah. But that's the age he's given here. And so that conforms with the law of retribution. He's a wicked king, and again, the Chronicler makes him really, really wicked king, and he dies young. Okay. Chapter 29. Hezekiah began to reign when he was 25 years old. Now, if you do the math, that means his father was 11. I don't get that, but that's the number say. And he reigned 29 years in Jerusalem. His mother's name was Abijah, the daughter of Zechariah. And he did what was right in the eyes of the Lord, according to all that David his father had done. Again, David is the patron saint of the book of Chronicles. So here we have a hero for the Chronicler's reform movement. Okay, since David and Solomon, we've been on the skids, and it's gotten pretty bad. Now comes the revival. Verse 3. In the first year of his reign, in the first month, he opened the doors of the house of the Lord and repaired them. So the very first thing he does is reopen the temple. He brought in the priests, yay, and the Levites, and he assembled them in the square of the east. And he tells them to bless and pray and do the right things, do your jobs. Verse 10. Now it is in my heart to make a covenant with the Lord, the God of Israel, that his fierce anger may turn away from me. My sons, do not now be negligent, for the Lord has chosen you to stand in his presence, to minister to him and to be his ministers and to burn incense to him. So he addresses the priests, he addresses the Levites, he gives them all kind of a stern talking to and urges them to do the right. Verse 25 of chapter 29. He stationed the Levites in the house of the Lord with cymbals, harps, and lyres, according to the commandment of David and of Gad, the king's seer, and of Nathan, his prophet. Verse 27. Then Hezekiah commanded that the burnt offering be offered on the altar. And when the burnt offering began, the song to the Lord began also, and the trumpets, accompanied by the instruments of David, king of Israel. The whole assembly worshipped, and the singers sang, and the trumpeters sounded. All this continued until the burnt offering was finished. Now, I don't know about you, but for a priest, this is like, it doesn't get any better than this, huh? Singers and trumpeters and soft sacrifice being offered, and this is, so in his vision, this is the good times. This is the good times. Verse 30, and Hezekiah the king and the princes commanded the Levites to sing praises to the Lord with the words of David and of Asaph the seer. Okay? So, again, a major emphasis here on the reign and renewal of Hezekiah. In chapter 30, then there's a celebration of Passover. Look at, by the way, next week, what day is Passover next week? Class? Is it on? It begins Good Friday night. Points for you. You must have a very fine pastor that you would know. She's my parishioner. So yeah, Friday night, Good Friday night is Passover, which means what? This year it corresponds to the calendar in the Gospel of John, which says that Jesus was sentenced by Pilate at noon on the day before Passover, so that as the lambs were being slaughtered in the temple, because remember the original call was slay the animal in the dark of the night, but there were so many animals, the priest said, well, night begins at noon. And so John makes the point that Jesus was condemned by Pilate and handed over at noon, about noon, where across town the slaughter of the lambs has just begun. Well, this year, by chance, our calendar corresponds to that. Okay? No, back to this. Okay. Go home and amaze and bore your friends. I'm under no illusion. We get excited about these things, but not everybody does. We're given the impression that the Jewish people had stopped celebrating Passover. And so that there has to be this big, Hezekiah has to launch this big move so that Passover be celebrated again. Look at verse 5. So they decreed to make a proclamation throughout all Israel from Beersheba in the south, to Dan in the north, that the people should come and keep the Passover to the Lord, the God of Israel, at Jerusalem. Verse 10. So the couriers went from city to city through the country of Ephraim and Manasseh, that's the northern tribes, and as far as Zebulun, that's way up north. But they laughed them to scorn, and mocked them. Who are those people who do that? The Samaritans. Remember, those are the people who live in the northern tribes. Only a few men of Asher, of Manasseh, and of Zebulun humbled themselves and came to Jerusalem. The hand of God was also upon Judah to give them one heart to do what the king and the princes commanded by the word of the Lord. Now, if you remember your chronology, I don't want to test you on this, but Hezekiah is king after the destruction of the northern kingdom. Okay? So as the chronicler tells the story, the northern kingdom has already been destroyed, and yet Hezekiah sends messengers to every little town in the north, saying, come celebrate the Passover with us in Jerusalem. And so this one of you asked about, how come this guy is so fixated on the northern tribes if they're all gone? Yeah, they are all gone as tribes, but remnants, bits and pieces of them, evidently came to the south and brought their traditions. And so that's why he can talk about all Israel. It's a little bit fictional, but at least there are representatives of the northern tribes who heed the call. Okay? Verse 25. The whole of chapter 30 still, the whole assembly of Judah and the priests and the Levites and the whole assembly that came out of Israel, okay, north and south, and the sojourners who came out of the land of Israel, and the sojourners who dwelt in Judah rejoiced. So there was great joy in Jerusalem, for since the time of Solomon, the son of David, king of Israel, there had been nothing like this in Jerusalem. Now, how to read that? My understanding is it that Passover was not celebrated during all those centuries? I find that hard to accept, that that's the author's intention. But what he means is that the whole nation, or its remnants, came to Jerusalem to celebrate the Passover. The next chapter, 31. Now, when all this was finished, all Israel, there's that phrase again, who were present went out to the cities of Judah and broke in pieces the pillars and hewed down the Asherim and broke down the high places and the altars throughout all Judah and Benjamin and in Ephraim and Manasseh until they had destroyed them all. So just an explosion of renewal blows out of Jerusalem in the wake of this. This is Hezekiah is a major player in 2 Chronicles, much bigger than he is in the book of Kings. Look at 31:20. Then Hezekiah did throughout all Judah, and he did what was good and right and faithful before the Lord his God. And every work that he undertook in the service of the house of God, and in accordance with the law and the commandments, seeking his God, he did with all his heart and prospered. Okay? Chapter 32, if you remember back in your reading of Isaiah and the book of Kings, then during Isaiah and Hezekiah's reign, there came the invasion of Sennacherib, general of the Assyrians, who laid siege to Jerusalem. Remember, this is the siege that they never conquered the city, but they laid siege to it, and they gobbled up all the other villages until Hezekiah paid tribute. But this was this miraculous defeat of Sennacherib's army when they got, the angel of death came in a plague or something, inflicted them all, and so they retreated and made peace. Verse 1. After these things and these acts of faithfulness, Sennacherib, king of Assyria, came and invaded Judah and encamped against the fortified cities, thinking to win them for himself. Verse 6. He set combat, this is Hezekiah, I believe, is the noun, the subject of these sentences. He set combat commanders over the people and gathered them together to him in the square at the gate of the city and spoke encouragingly to them, saying, "Be strong and of good courage. Do not be afraid or dismayed before the king of Assyria and all the horde that is with him, for there is one greater with us than with him." Verse 8, last line. And the people took confidence from the words of Hezekiah, king of Judah. So Hezekiah is rallying the forces against the Assyrians. Verse 20. Then Hezekiah the king and Isaiah the prophet, son of Amos, prayed because of this and cried to heaven. And the Lord sent an angel who cut off all the mighty warriors and commanders and officers of the camp of the king of Assyria. So now the book of Kings goes on a greater length to tell this story, but the point of the author is Hezekiah, like David, is both a savvy political ruler and a faithful worshiper of Yahweh. And in the law of retribution, he's going to get whatever he prays for, and so he does. Verse 22. So the Lord saved Hezekiah, and the inhabitants of Jerusalem from the hand of Sennacherib, king of Assyria, and from the hand of all his enemies, and he gave them rest on every side. And many brought gifts to the Lord to Jerusalem, and precious things to Hezekiah, king of Judah, so that he was exalted in the sight of all nations from that time onward. Chapter 33. Here is bad King Manasseh. Let me go back and read for you the Deuteronomistic historian's view of Manasseh. Doesn't take that long. Manasseh was 12 years old when he began to reign, and he reigned 55 years. And he did what was evil in the sight of the Lord. This is, by the way, 2 Kings 20. He rebuilt the high places which Hezekiah his father had destroyed. He erected altars for Baal and made an Asherah, as Ahaz, king of Israel, had done, and worshipped all the host of heaven and served them. And he built altars in the house of the Lord. Verse 6, he burned his son as an offering and practiced soothsaying and augury and dealt with mediums and with wizards. Verse 7, and the graven image of Asherah that he had made, he set in the house of which the Lord said to David, in this house and in Jerusalem, which I have chosen, I will put my name forever. So according to the author of Kings, Manasseh puts an Asherah statue in the temple. Okay? They did not listen, and Manasseh seduced them to do more evil than the nations had done, whom the Lord destroyed before the people of Israel. And that's it. That's his story. But he lives how many years? He was king for 55 years. Okay? So he's a bad king, lives a long time. Now, let's read the Chronicler's vision. Okay? 33. Manasseh was 12. Read that already. He reigned 55 years. Verse 2. He did what was evil in the sight of the Lord, according to the abominable practices of the nations. So that sounds familiar. In fact, we get a lot of the same kind of activities here. He burns children. He raises statues. Verse 10. The Lord spoke to Manasseh and to his people, but they gave no heed. Therefore the Lord brought upon them the commanders of the army of the king of Assyria, who took Manasseh with hooks and bound him with fetters of bronze and brought him to Babylon. And when he was in distress, he entreated the favor of the Lord his God and humbled himself greatly before the God of his fathers. He prayed to him, and God received his entreaty and heard his supplication and brought him again to Jerusalem into his kingdom. Then Manasseh knew that the Lord was God. Verse 15, and he took away the foreign gods and the idol from the houses of the Lord, and all the altars that he had built on the mountain of the house of the Lord and in Jerusalem, and he threw them outside the city. He also restored the altar of the Lord and offered upon it sacrifices of peace and of thanksgiving. And he commanded Judah to serve the Lord, the God of Israel. Nevertheless, the people still sacrificed at the high places, but only to the Lord their God. So, what does the chronicler have that the author of Kings does not have? Manasseh has a conversion. He undoes the things. Yeah, I guess that's the right word. He backs away from all the things he had done. And though the people continue in their evil way, he is an altar boy in the last part of his life. And that comforts the author that the law of retribution is in force. By the way, there is in what we call the Apocrypha, and some Bibles have it in them, a little biblical book called the Prayer of Manasseh. Okay? So, or you might have heard of it. It's a beautiful prayer of contrition. And it's just one chapter long. And you'll come across it. Episcopalians use it in their worship for some reason. Is it one of the things in the... Oh, there it is. It's a reading. Had I read the book, I would have known that. Okay. So we have a different picture of Manasseh in Chronicles, huh? Okay. So then follows Amos, his son, and Josiah. Now Josiah, in the book of Kings, Hezekiah is a good king, and he's got Isaiah to help him. But in Kings, Josiah is the reformer. Okay? In Chronicles, it's Hezekiah who is the reformer. Josiah, yes, but he doesn't get quite the press. Okay? But we also have to deal. How did Josiah die? Do you remember? In battle against the Egyptians. The Assyrian Empire was crumbling, and that's what allowed Josiah to kind of expand his borders and have extra tax money to renovate the temple, where they found the book of the law, remember? And that spurs up another renewal. But then the Pharaoh of Egypt comes to help support the king of Assyria against the rising Babylonian Empire, and Josiah stands in the way to say, stop, don't do that, and he dies at a famous place called Megiddo, as in the mountain of Megiddo, Har Megiddo, or in Revelation, Armageddon. Okay, so you got to deal. So is Josiah a good guy or a bad guy? Well, the chronicler has his answer. He's got to explain it, and let's find Josiah's death. 35:20. After all of this, when Josiah had prepared the temple, Necho, king of Egypt, went up to fight at Carchemish on the Euphrates, and Josiah went out against him, but he sent envoys to him. That is, Pharaoh sends envoys to Josiah, saying, "What have we to do with each other, king of Judah? I'm not coming against you this day, but against the house with which I'm at war. God has commanded me to make haste. Cease opposing God, who is with me, lest he destroy you." Nevertheless, Josiah would not turn away from him, but disguised himself in order to fight with him. He did not listen to the words of Necho from the mouth of God. So Pharaoh is presented as a messenger of God who tells Josiah, don't fight me, but he does, and thus he is killed. Now again, that whole little episode with Necho doesn't appear in the book of Kings. But what does it do? It explains how it is that good reforming King Josiah had his life snuffed off right in the middle. Again, which helps explain how the law of retribution applies. The last chapter. Yay! It's a long read. I mean, it's a lot of words here. So, the last Kings. Chapter 36, in quick order, deals with the weak kings. Jehoahaz in verse 1, Jehoiakim in verse 5, Jehoiakim in verse 9, and let's look at verse 11. Zedekiah was 21 years old when he began to reign, and he reigned 11 years. He did what was evil in the sight of the Lord his God. He did not humble himself before Jeremiah the prophet, who spoke, and that's unique. That reference does not appear in Kings. Now again, Jeremiah and the king interact in the book of Jeremiah, but in the book of Kings, there's no mention of Jeremiah. He also rebelled against King Nebuchadnezzar, who had made him swear by God. He stiffened his neck and hardened his heart against turning to the Lord. All the leading priests and the people likewise were exceedingly unfaithful, following all the abominations of the nations. And they polluted the house of the Lord, which he had hallowed in Jerusalem. So, you see, the chronicler is preparing us for the end here, isn't he? The king is so bad, and all the priests and all the people, that they have proven unfaithful. Verse 15, the Lord, the God of their fathers, sent persistently to them by his messengers. Verse 16, but they kept mocking the messengers of God, despising his words, and scoffing at his prophets. Verse 17, therefore he brought up against them the king of the Chaldeans, that's Babylon, who slew their young men with the sword in the house of the sanctuary. Verse 19. And they burned the house of God, and broke down the wall of Jerusalem, and burned all its palaces with fire, and destroyed all its precious vessels. He took into exile in Babylon those who had escaped from the sword, and they became servants to him and to his sons until the establishment of the kingdom of Persia. Now here is the unique addition. To fulfill the word of the Lord by the mouth of Jeremiah, until the land had enjoyed its Sabbaths. All the days that it lay desolate, it kept Sabbath to fulfill 70 years. So Jeremiah 25 spoke about the 70 years. But what the chronicler goes on to say, which is a lovely image, that during those years of Israel's infidelity, Jews weren't keeping the Sabbath. But now, because God had finally stepped in, the land would have years of Sabbath rest to make up for all the missed days off, all the days when the land should have been allowed to rest when the Jews did not allow it to rest. Okay, so it gives a theological meaning that like does Kings, to the end of things. And then we have this. Now, in the first year of Cyrus, king of Persia, that the word of the Lord by the mouth of Jeremiah might be accomplished, the Lord stirred up the spirit of Cyrus, king of Persia. Where have you read that before? It's the opening of Ezra. Now the question is, which came first? Did Ezra write it first, and did Chronicles copy it? Or did Chronicles write it first and Ezra copied it? Most scholars propose that it was original to the book of Ezra first. That's their, I don't want to go into it, but that's what they propose. But notice how that changes how the book ends not with destruction, which Kings does. Kings ends with, and all this was done because the people had not obeyed God, period. And here, suddenly, there's an open door and an image of hope. Again, because the author of Chronicles is addressing the exiles who had returned. Huh? That's the link to them. The book began with Adam and Eve. And all those, we didn't read it, but all the genealogy. And it makes a link to the Jews who have returned and are taking possession of the land once more, instructing them what kind of people they should be. They should be a religious people. They should be a worshiping people. They should have priests and Levites and songs and good orderly temple worship, and they should support, all Israel should come together and support this important life of worship, because that's what holds Israel together now, since the exile is over. Questions, comments? Yes, Peter.
You know, I had in my mind that Zedekiah in Kings was not a bad king.
He was a weak king.
A weak king,
Mm-hmm.
yeah. But he started off the Exodus, or the deportation, because actually at this time Assyria was in control. Babylon was in control,
Mm-hmm.
and he just decided to stop making payments.
Right, but he didn't do it just because he felt strong, because he's being pulled. There was a pro-Egypt party and a pro-Babylonian party, and he's being pulled one way or another, and he's always making the wrong choice. Judah was not big enough to be independent. It had two big crushing neighbors, and there was an anti-Babylonian party among the upper class, and they kind of played Zedekiah. And Jeremiah kept trying to prop him up. You know, don't fight, don't stop paying taxes. But Zedekiah is presented as being too weak to stand up to that force. Other comments or questions?
Just one more thing.
Yes.
Two places when we were reading, once it said Aram and once it said Assyria. Are they the same thing?
Aram and Syria are, Aram is actually, find the text, because Aram is usually the country of Syria, modern day Syria. Assyria was a much bigger entity that had its roots down in the Mesopotamian area, the Tigris and Euphrates. So they're probably not the same thing, but I want to see the text to make sure. Okay? Other comments or questions? Okay. I need to wake up the filmer.
She's jumping. Can you tell me?
Okay, I was going to say 1, 2, 3, say wake up Mary Ellen, but all right. So a break. Take a break.
Oh, that felt good.